2025 seems to be the year for Australian whiskey because I have got yet another category winner from the World Whiskies Awards 2025. Join with me as I compare a 22-year-old Australian whiskey with its 12-year-old counterpart. Hey guys, I'm Nath Martin, the Whisky Scribe. I'm a whiskey enthusiast and I love all things whiskey, but taste is subjective and there's a lot of different whiskies out there. So whether you consider yourself a connoisseur or you're just looking to understand more about whiskey, let's explore it all together. If you want to see more from me, hit the subscribe button. I put up regular whiskey review videos and a few educational pieces, and you can also follow me over on Instagram. Now, the good people at Hellyers Road have sent me another sample, and this time it's also a winner from the World Whiskies Awards. A category winner in the category single cask, single malt, over 21-year-old Australian whiskey. Now, you might think that there's not a lot of whiskies in that category, but it's now been, I think, 30 years since the Australian whiskey industry actually started, and we are seeing age statements coming out of distilleries from Tasmania, from the likes of Sullivan's Cove, Hellyers Road, even Lark and quite a few others down that way have put out significant age statements. There was even a 30-year-old from Sullivan's Cove. So this isn't an empty category. I don't know how many were in there, but there were over 100 Australian entrants to the World Whiskies Awards competition in all. So what I've got today, dig down into it, not that one, I'll tell you what that one is in a sec. What I've got today is a sample of the 22-year-old American Oak. So this is the oldest age statement that Hellyers Road's put out to date. You might remember a couple of weeks ago I got to review the 21-year-old peated, but this is a whiskey 2 decades in the making. It's a single cask, cask number 2325.03. It was laid down on November of 2002 and matured for an extraordinary 22 years, 3 months and 25 days in one American Oak ex-bourbon cask. And this is the thing that I think is actually really cool about this, because normally when you have somebody saying American Oak or ex-bourbon, you don't know what bourbon cask it is, but they're actually telling us in this case that it's Jack Daniel's Tennessee Whiskey, a 200-litre single cask. That's really cool because there's a lot of Jack Daniel's Tennessee Whiskey out there, so you'd have to assume that it makes up a portion of the ex-bourbon barrels that Australian and Scottish whiskey industry are putting their whiskey into. But you never actually get told that it's explicitly a Jack Daniel's cask. So that'll be an interesting point of difference to look at. By the time this was ready for bottling, it was past the halfway point, and this is why you don't see a lot of high age statements from Australian whiskey. Our angel share is huge. Like in Scotland, you're losing about maybe 1 or 2% of the barrel every single year to the angel share. In Australia, in some places, it's as high as 10%. Yeah. Who would have thought that the Scottish Angels were so discreet? In Australia, they're absolute piss pots. But this is considered an exceptional example of Australian aged whiskey, showing the results of patience and influence of maturation by the sea, milled, mashed, fermented, and distilled on site like all Hellyers Road whiskies. Now, I'm not going to read the tasting notes just yet. I want to experience it for myself, but I've got a really cool point of difference for this one in terms of how I'm going to be tasting this, because they've also provided their American Oak 12-year-old. And with this one, I don't actually know, it just says ex-bourbon casks, so I don't know what bourbon casks. It might be Jack Daniel's, it might be Heaven Hill, which is a really, really common one in the whiskey industry. But it's essentially the same thing, comparing 10 years of age difference. So 12 years versus 22 years. The ABV is different as well. The 12-year-old is 46.2%, and the 22-year-old is a wonderful cask strength of 56.5. And if you know anything about me, I very much love my cask strengths. Now I'm going to, of course, because this is a special whiskey, the 1920s blender's glass. Okay, I'm intrigued. I'm not going to say too much about it just yet because I'm also going to pop out the 12-year-old as a side-by-side. Partially using different glasses just so I don't get them mixed up. That's interesting. Okay, there's a little bit more depth of color here. So this is like a light golden sort of color. This one, you've got like a little bit more of a bronzing happening to it, but I don't know if you can see here, but there's wonderful thick, slow running legs on both of them. Not quite as slow running on the 12-year-old because that is a lower ABV. Which do I taste first? Okay, I'm going to give them both a proper nose. Okay, I really like the nose on this. There's a fresh sort of like a bit of a musty wood sort of note. You can get like there's elements of the grain coming across a little bit shortbready. Kind of getting like a little bit of almonds and that sort of thing, as well as there's a little bit of a fruity note. It's sort of, I'd probably call it apricot. It's interesting to pick up apricot on the nose and actually be happy about that because I love apricot as a note in whiskey. I do not like apricots in the flesh. Yeah, I think that's everything I'm getting off that, but it is a very inviting nose. Now, if I then compare that to the 12-year-old, on first nosing, I thought that this was just sort of like a lighter version of that, but there's elements that just aren't in here yet. So on the 22-year-old, there's now that I've smelled this one, I'm noticing that the difference is there's like this oily sort of buttery aroma coming across in the 22-year-old, whereas that's just not there in this one. So the fruit sort of smell in here, there's no mustiness to it. It's just coming across a lot fresher. Now I know I started nosing that one, but it's just occurred to me that the 22-year-old is a much higher ABV. So I'm going to taste the 12-year-old and then the 22, just so I'm not destroying my palate before I get to go back and forth. So the fruity notes in there are coming across on the palate. The butter element that was on the nose of the 22-year-old but not on the nose of the 12, it's actually in the palate of the 12. So tasting this, there is like a little bit of a buttery mouthfeel going on there. That's sort of, it's blended kind of nicely with that sort of, on the palate I wouldn't call it apricots, I might call it more orchard fruits, but it's there, and there is this underlying biscuit note. But I would say, as far as a 12-year-old goes, there's a little bit more to that compared to if you're trying some Scottish 12-year-old like your Glenfiddich or your Glenlivet, you know, commonly available single malts aged in bourbon casks. There's a little bit more to it, and part of that is because the aging in Australia happens at a very different rate. Don't ever look at an Australian age statement and compare it directly to a Scottish one, because as I mentioned with that angel share, but you've also got that whole process of, over time, the whiskey gets absorbed into the wood of the barrel and then pushed back in. And it happens like this, very gradually in Scotland. Whereas in Australia, it's a much faster rate. Now, I know you've got like your places like Queensland and New South Wales where the temperature fluctuations are a lot greater than perhaps Tasmania, which is a little bit of a closer climate to Scotland. But there's also those atmospheric pressure sort of changes, you know, a lot more of these like high and low pressure systems, and that still actually has an effect on the barrel, and so you get this much faster aging process. The angel share is really, really obvious, But I almost feel like if you're going to put an age statement on Australian whiskey, you almost need a table on the back, kind of like your conversion of human years to dog years, converting Scottish years to Australian whiskey years. I don't know who would actually draw up that table, but it's not a fair comparison to put a 12-year-old Scotch against a 12-year-old Tasmanian whiskey, because there's just a little bit more to this. It's had more of that weather pushing the flavour into the whiskey. I like that. I'd be happy with that on its own. But fortunately, I've also got a 22-year-old whiskey here to try. Slange. Okay, this does not disappoint. In spite of that high ABV, yes, it is very robust and there's a lot of flavor in there. It's not rough. So that 22 years has really balanced everything out, and there's quite a lot of harmony between the flavors that are happening here. That I mentioned there was like this buttery texture as well as sort of apricot on the nose. What's come across on the palate there, again, I probably wouldn't call it apricot on the palate, partially because it's blended so much with that buttery texture that it almost feels like you've made a butter out of some sort of orchard fruit. It's like avocado oil or something like. Not that this tastes like avocado oil, but I mean converting something into a form of oil from it. And I mentioned before there was a bit of almond on the nose. It's still sort of a nutty note, but if anything, it's bordering on almost meaty. Like this is fresh and zesty, but there's still this like oily chewiness to it that gives it a lot of depth. Of course, a wonderful warmth that happens on the chest, but the finish is also, it's just a little bit longer. It's lingering on the palate a little bit longer than the 12-year-old. Now I'm curious to see what their tasting notes are now, compared to what I picked up. Okay, on the nose they say toasted nuts and sweet coconut ice lead into stone fruits, nectarine and peach, along with fresh cut melon. So yeah, getting a lot of those sort of fruit notes. A drop of water reveals herbaceous notes of manuka before leaving fresh cut watermelon and honeydew. On the palate it says lemon curd, sticky ginger spice treacle cake with hints of toasty charred oak, followed by stone fruit highlights of peaches in syrup. A note of fresh herbaceous Australian gumtree leaf lingers. That was too much nose. I do pick up the oak in there. I can definitely see how you would take that as ginger treacle cake. There is a freshness that you could call gum leaves. There's nothing in those notes that I would say no, absolutely not. And then it says the finish is a long and fruit-forward finish, leaves you wanting more of this delicate and enticing dram. I do want more of this delicate, enticing dram. I quite like that. The question is price though, because the retail price of this is $1,450 Australian. It's because it's a single cask, it is an award winner. Again, I don't think that it's priced itself out of the market. That is probably an appropriate price for this. There's not a lot of Australian 22-year-old single cask, single malts on the market. So that pricing is fair, but the 12-year-old is really, really good too. So I would say, if you are somebody who's wanting to try an Australian age statement whiskey, you can go for the 12-year-old and you're not going to be disappointed. It is a lovely dram. If money isn't an object, or you have that sort of money to throw around on whiskey, this is definitely well worth a try. And I think there were only 80 bottles. Yeah, only 80 bottles came out of that cask because it was so close to, well, it was past half mast, as they say. So it really does come down to price. Both of them are well worth drinking. If you've got the money to do the experiment, try them both side by side. I can attest that this was actually quite a nice pairing to be able to have the same, essentially the same whiskey at different stages in its growth. Yeah, it's not disappointing to come back to the 12-year-old after having the 22. But I can definitely see how this one in its category, that's a delicious dram. And all the more reason to keep exploring whiskies from Hellyers Road, whether it's a high, mid-range, or even then non-age statement whiskies are still really, really enjoyable. Considering I only recently reviewed the Hellyers Road 21-year-old peated that won the award for Best Australian Single Malt Whiskey, how would I compare this one to that one? If I'm looking at score, like how I would score this, I actually think they're both on par. So I think they're both about like pretty much the same quality. I will score these about the same. The only thing I would say is this is leaning more onto the fresh, the fruit sort of side, whereas the peat, it had more of this like sort of old wood and smoke sort of note to it. So it comes down to what you're feeling like. I don't want just one type of whiskey. I love exploring them all. So if I had a night where I was wanting something that was like really intricately balanced but had that woody sort of smoky note to it, I'd be going for the 21-year-old peated. But if I'm wanting something that's like this harmonious fruit sort of thing going on, this is the whiskey that I would be choosing out of the two. So both of them really just as good as each other. So thank you, Hellyers Road. And no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, enjoy what's in your glass, no matter how much it costs, what the age statement or no age statement, and slange.